Now that we've looked at some of the ways of historical thinking, let's actually get into some of the events and some of the persons and some of the movements of thought that are going to begin to contribute to the development of church history from 1500 to the present. When we think about this date, 1500, when we think about how we bracket off church history too, 1500, there's nothing really magical about that date. 1500 is a sort of a convenient benchmark for ending the study of church history 1 and starting the study of church history 2. It's been done that way for many generations. When I had church history 1 and 2 in seminary, that was the way that my professors did it as well. But there's really not anything magical about 1500 when the people living in the Christian world, when 1499 passed into 1500, there were no celebrations. Nobody said, okay, we're now in church history 2 world. Nobody really said that. 1500 came and went, and nobody really thought that it was a really powerful marker or departing point from the medieval world to the modern world. But historians, in going back to the past, looking at the persons and events of the past, looking at the evidence that they have in front of them, historians interpret 1500 as a convenient starting point for the modern world. But for our purposes in this class, 1500 is going to be sort of a loose date. We're going to be talking about some events that occur just before 1400, and we'll also be talking about events that occur just after it in the next couple of lectures. And this lecture is called Prelude to the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a very important intellectual, political, scientific, cultural movement that is part and parcel of church history, the history of God's people. In the Christian West, in Europe, ultimately in America, ultimately all over the world. All of us in the church, and I would say the invisible church, the church writ large, all of us who are followers of Christ, we all have drawn on, we all are indebted to, in some way, whether it be directly or indirectly, we are indebted to this cultural, intellectual movement known as the Renaissance. Now, what is the meaning of the Renaissance? What does it mean? Well, the word Renaissance, as you probably know, means rebirth. There is starting in the late 1300s, progressing into the 1400s, and definitely when you get into the 1500s, there is an interest, a new interest in old things in Europe. A new interest in old things, a new interest in classical antiquity, the world of the Greeks and the Romans. The world of the Greeks and the Romans that produced the Greek and Latin classics, classics of philosophy, classics of mythology, classics of art and science and politics. Europe has a new interest in antiquity. So there's something new to the Renaissance, and there's something old to the Renaissance. The interest in antiquity is new. The subject of what they're interested in is old. The Renaissance leads European thought as a whole. European theological thought, European intellectual method, the way that they approach their subject matter, European literature, art, music, science, politics, you name it. European thought shifts from a medieval mindset to a modern mindset. And it's composed of a lot of different aspects. But basically what it is a shift from. The medieval mindset places its emphasis on things that don't change. And it also places its emphasis on another world, right? So a heavenly world. In the medieval period, and I'm speaking very generally here, in the medieval period, say around 1000 or 1100, right? We'll call that right in the middle of the medieval period. Your assumptions would be that the world is what it is. It doesn't change. It's defined by the fall. It's defined by the curse of sin. And there's no sense in trying to change it because its condition is decreed by what happened in the garden, right? So you can't change it. So the medieval world, the medieval mindset is the world does not change. The world is the same. And because the world is cursed by sin, because the world is sort of a victim of Adam and Eve's sin in the garden, as Paul describes in the book of Romans, for example, this is not our home. This world that is fallen is not our home. We don't love the world, as the Apostle John wrote. Instead, what do? We seek our treasure. We seek the things that we love. Our affections are placed on another world, a heavenly world. So we have, as Augustine said, a city of man, which is, headed towards decay and destruction ultimately. And if you put your hope and your confidence in that, then you're going to be part of that destruction. And then there's also a city of God, and the city of God is a perfect city. The city of God is where the Savior dwells. And if we place our faith in the Savior, then we are of that world. And so there's no sense in valuing this world that much. There's no sense in trying to change the conditions of this world because your life in this world is very short and your true citizenship is in another world. Right? So that's one element of a medieval mindset. Another element of a medieval mindset is a strong commitment to hierarchy and authority. And so this goes into the medieval mindset very deeply. So Aristotle talked about this. Aristotle and Plato talked about this, that whatever station you're born into, that's the station you are going to die in, right? So if you're a laborer, if you work the soil, well, that's the place that God put you. And if you were a laborer, if you were tilling the soil, you would never have thought in, say, 1000 or the year 1100, gosh, I really don't like doing this. I think I'll go to school and, major in some field of study and pick another job for myself in order to get out of tilling the soil. Then I can maybe be a lawyer or maybe be a merchant or maybe be a physician, a doctor, or maybe be a teacher. You wouldn't have thought of your life in those terms. You wouldn't have the aspiration to be something else that you were born into, and that your father was born into, and that your grandparents were born into, and that your great-grandparents were born into. No, the expectation would be that you were born a tiller of the soil, your children would be tillers of the soil, your grandchildren would be tillers of the soil, on into eternity, right? Until the Lord comes back, right? That's your place. And if you leave your place and go seek to be in another place, you're breaking the will of God. And you're creating a vacuum. You're creating a hole that you're leaving. And if you stick yourself somewhere else into some other station in life, you're going to be displacing another person. And all of this is part and parcel of the will of God. This is all a very structured, orderly world that God has established. And if you try to break out of that order, that's sinful thinking, right? Another thing is that if you were born as an aristocrat, if you were born as a nobleman, that's your place, right? So if you were a tiller of the soil, you didn't look at the house on the hill and fall in love with the lord of the manor's daughter. You just didn't do that. Because the lord of the manor's daughter is going to marry another aristocrat, right? And you didn't look at his wealth and think, I should have that. I deserve that. I am just as good as he is. These are all modern ideas, right? And the Renaissance is a marker, right? The Renaissance is a marker of a shift from this old way of thinking, this old medieval way of thinking, a way of thinking that highlights and underscores staticity, right? An unchanging world, and authority. You bow to authority. The king speaks, and that word is law. The Pope speaks, and he speaks for God. Your Lord, on the manner that you live in, requires you to do certain things, and you are duty-bound to do it. And if you don't do it, you're not just sinning against the Lord. You are sinning against the entire order of things that God has established. Right? So the Renaissance is a rebirth of the classical world, the world of Greece and Rome. This medieval mindset arises out of the ashes of the fall of Rome in the West, right? In 476, Rome ceases to be a viable political administrative entity. And the Germanic invaders that come across the Russian steppes and ultimately will displace that Roman order, establish new kingdoms and establish new orders in the places that used to be administered by the Romans. And with the destruction of the Western Roman Empire comes a new way of thinking, right? But in the Renaissance figures try to recover the world of Rome, the world of Greece, because they look at that world and they see beauty, they see culture, they see truth, and they look at their own period and they see darkness, and they see intellectual backwardness. They see artistic and cultural backwardness, and they long for the days of the great Caesars, and they long for the days of the great thinkers like Lucretius, even like someone like Marcus Aurelius, the great philosopher king of the Romans in the 2nd century AD. Another thing that's really interesting about the people of the Renaissance, and this is a way to think historically, we don't try to put yourself in their shoes. Let's say that you're walking around, you're a stonemason, right? In somewhere in France. Let's say that you're a stonemason somewhere in France. And in France, as a stonemason, you're interested in good rock. Rock that is good to build with, that is sturdy, that is durable, that doesn't break, that doesn't fissure and crack. It can be used for building. It can be used for building a great cathedral, for example, or building some meeting structure, some political structure. You're interested in stones. You're interested in stone cutting. You're interested in building materials. And as you're walking around in your native France that you grew up in, let's say that you grew up in, let's just say that you grew up in central France near Lyon, right? Well, around Lyon, you're born into that world, and in your daily, ordinary travels around your town, you notice these ancient structures, these old structures like a Roman aqueduct, or the ruins of a Roman temple, or a Roman road, right? And you see like an aqueduct, and it's so beautiful, the arches, and it's so functional. It brings water from the Alps down into your town. And it's still in use all these years later. And you ask the question, who built this? Who were the people that built this? Well, you wouldn't know. I mean, you wouldn't have gone to school to learn history. You didn't have a boring history teacher that gave you the old names and places and dates from Roman history. You didn't have that. So you ask your parents, did somebody in your childhood build this aqueduct? No, it's just always been there. You ask maybe your grandparents, you ask the town elders, who built this? And they would say, I don't know. It's just always been there. And as far back as you can go, in terms of living generations, nobody can really say who it was that built this. It's just always been there. In fact, to even ask the question, where did this come from? You probably wouldn't have asked that question in a medieval mindset. You would just assume that it's always been there. The thinkers of the Renaissance were really some of the very first people in 1,000 years to ask questions like that. What is that structure? And who built it? And why did they build it that way? And how is it so beautiful? And how is it so functional? How do they balance functionality and beauty in a perfect way, right? Or to look at a Roman temple or a Greek temple. Yeah, it's to a pagan god, but look at how beautiful it is. Or to find some relic from the past, a mosaic or a coin, or something small like that. In the medieval period, all of the remains of Roman civilization, of Greek civilization, they were everywhere to see, especially if you lived in France, or if you lived in Spain, or if you lived in Italy, of course, if you lived in Greece, but even if you lived in North Africa. These old remnants of a great civilization were everywhere. They were everywhere. But they just always been there. Sometimes medieval people would take the materials, the stones, and reuse them to build new structures, like the stone cutter that I was mentioning a second ago. If you were a stone cutter, you would have a particular appreciation for, good building materials. And so stone cutters would often take the materials that had been there in an old Roman structure and reuse them. So my point in all of this is that the Renaissance thinkers, they want to recover a civilization that was truly great. They looked at their world that they lived in and they thought, the world that we live in is a world that is rent by war and chaos and struggle, and the culture of our world is really has really missed out on something in the past that existed and has now been lost. And so the Renaissance is an attempt to recover something that was lost. Now, in recovering that which was lost, in rediscovering the world of classical antiquity, for example, not only do they sort of bring a new appreciation for the old things, but what comes out of that appreciation for something old is something else that's new. And that is what we know of as the modern world. When we say the modern world, we're talking about modern methods of thought. So instead of the old medieval mindset of just receiving authority, receiving a word that claims to be the truth from your elders, or from your teachers, or from the church, or from the king, or from the Lord of the manor, instead of just receiving that word as absolute truth and not questioning it. In the Renaissance, that's sort of rejected as a method. In the Renaissance, what is pursued is instead the authority of reason, to understand human reason and look to human reason as an authority, or to look to experience as an authority, right? So Francis Bacon he writes in the 17th century. It's in the 1600s later on, but Francis Bacon is particularly famous for this, for rejecting authority-based pronouncements and instead going to experimentation. Well, let's test this. Let's test this statement of Aristotle and let's see if it's really true. And so you do an experiment and you see if it's true. And if it's not true, then you actually throw out the old pronouncement and you replace it with something that's new and is based on a reading of your experience, right? That's brand new. That's what the modern mentality gives us. Looking to experience, looking to reason. Now, that's going to have a profound impact on the church as well. Because another one of the important methods of Renaissance thinkers was to go back to the sources, to go back to the original sources. So don't just tell me that Aristotle said this and such. What do the documents say? Let's look at Aristotle's writing and let's examine it and let's see what he said. Don't just tell me that Plato said this, or don't just tell me that Augustine said this. Let's look to the sources, right? Well, what is the Reformation if it's not going back to the sources? Martin Luther wants to go back to the Scriptures. That's his whole, that's his whole mission in 1517. Let's go back to the Scriptures to see what do the Scriptures say about how I can be saved. Don't just listen to what the Pope says. Don't just look to what church tradition has always told you. What do the sources say? What do the Scriptures say about how to be saved? So you see, Martin Luther is employing a Renaissance methodology, right, in going back to the sources. So do you see that the Renaissance is not just pretty paintings or not just beautiful music, right? The Renaissance is a change in the way Europeans, and Europe is where the church is at this point, the change in the way Europeans try to ascertain the truth. And basically their method is going to be called humanism. Now, when we think about the term humanism, we think immediately about skepticism for religious truth, skepticism for the Bible. We think about secular humanism. And that's how we often use the term humanism today. But remember, change over time. When the Renaissance thinkers called themselves humanists, right? They didn't think of themselves as breaking away from the truth of the Scriptures or the truth of the church. They thought they were recovering it. They didn't see the human person as being the measure and the sum of all truth, like a secular humanist might today. When they were looking at the pursuit of truth, they believed that human beings were the ones that were most concerned about the truth of all the creatures in God's creation. They wanted to provide the way to enjoy life the most. They wanted to find the most efficient political organization. They wanted to understand the world around them as best they could. They wanted to find virtue in temperance, in moderation. They wanted to find what Aristotle called the golden mean. And they did want to have freedom from authority, but they weren't seeking to break the bonds of authority in the same way that later generations will try to do that. Renaissance thinkers were still tied to the authority of the church and still tied to the authority of the state. When I'm talking about Renaissance thinkers, people like on your slides, people like Petrarch, people like Leonardo Bruni. These were intellectuals who were some of the first to think about this new way of thinking. And so, as humanists, their primary interest is man. That's why they're called humanists. They're not called humanists because they're trying to define humanity as the sum of all truth. That does come later, but it comes much, much later. We will get into some of that in this class, of course. Now, just to sum it up, the Renaissance is a rebirth. It's a new interest in something that's old that will eventually result in something new again, right? And as your slideshow says, Petrarch, Leonardo Bruni, these are two individuals that really help us understand the meaning of the Renaissance. They're early thinkers. They go back to the 14th century, and they sort of represent the shift from the old medieval mindset to a modern one. And you can look at those quotes and look at some of those points I gave you on the slideshow to bring some clarity to that. And that'll conclude our look at the Renaissance.